Hey, what's up guys? Thanks for stopping by the channel. So for this video, we're going to be taking a look back in Grand Seiko's vintage catalog and checking out this reference SBGR017. And I'll admit, I didn't even know this watch existed until a short time ago. I actually stumbled across another YouTuber's video, Mark from over at On the Wrist from Off the Cuff. He did a really good job comparing this particular Grand Seiko to some of the Seiko SARB models he had in his personal collection. And I'll admit that with respect to the dimensions and some of the design, this Grand Seiko does resemble a SARB to a certain extent, but it does kick it up a notch when you get to the level of finishing and details on the dial. And for me, the real standout feature about this particular reference is the bracelet. This bracelet I don't think exists on any other Grand Seikos, even in their current collection, or at least the ones I've reviewed, and I hope they consider bringing it back because it's absolutely phenomenal. Now, I was fortunate enough to track down this model from another Canadian watch enthusiast, and when I picked it up off of them, it even came with the full kit, including the dated card. So this watch is actually from 2001, well over 20 years old, and it's still running like a champ. So why don't we flip the camera around now, and you can actually take a close-up look at the Grand Seiko SBGR017 in the studio. So now that we're in the studio, we can take a closer look at this Grand Seiko SBGR017. And before getting into the actual dimensions and specs for this timepiece, for me personally, I wanted to mention three pillars that I think make this watch stand out among other Seiko and Grand Seiko models in their current collection. So the first pillar is this 12-sided bezel design. So you don't often see like a dodecagon pattern on Grand Seikos, and each of the points to the bezel line up perfectly with an hour index, which is really cool to see. And at the level of a dial, there's a couple of things that really stand out to me. One is the use of the texture to the dial, and that's nothing new for Grand Seiko, but this is more of a geometric pattern, and it's a mixture of like small hexagons and parallel lines. And it's fairly subtle under some angles, but then you just hit the light right, and it's extremely visually interesting to look at. The other cool thing about the dial is the use of dual Arabic numerals, which is not often found on Grand Seikos. So you got a 12 o'clock and a 6 o'clock Arabic index in a really cool font, and then the other hour markers are applied in multifaceted baton style indexes. And then the last pillar I want to talk about, and it was alluded to at the start of the video, is this bracelet. Most Grand Seikos stop at a standard 3-link design. This one has multiple components to it. It's held in place by very robust slot screws, and you can just see it's visually interesting too, because you have a lot of different patterns. You have raised and chamfered edges to some of the links. You have cylinders that are highly polished. You still got the micro beveling to the flanks of the links as well. And the articulation and just the way it drapes over the wrist is amazing. Now, unfortunately, there are no micro adjustments to this class, but that's nothing new for Grand Seiko. You do get half links, and just how comfortable this watch wears on the wrist really makes me forget that there's no micro adjustment. So for reference, here's a quick in-studio wrist shot just to show you how this watch wears on a 7.5-inch wrist, or that's 19 centimeters in circumference if you use the metric system. And you can see, looking down the barrel here, the watch just drapes and lays very flat on the wrist, but still has some presence to it. Sized up for my wrist, this watch weighs in at a healthy 157 grams on the bracelet. Now, if we actually run the numbers on this watch, you're getting a 39mm case diameter here. Flipping the watch to the side, lug to lug, so that's the wingspan between my thumbs right here, Comes in at 45.7 millimeters, and I like how those lugs arc down and have drilled lug holes. In terms of thickness, I grab it at 13.3 millimeters. That's from the bottom of a signed and screwed down Grand Seiko logo caseback, and then to the top of a slightly domed sapphire crystal that carries their super clear coating. Now, some of that AR coating on the other side did fade a little bit, but this watch is of course 20 years old, but the legibility remains extremely high, and that's really impressive. It tells you just how well Grand Seiko does their Zaratsu polish, and there's no lume on the dial whatsoever, but it's really easy to read this watch at a glance. Now, I did mention that I thought this watch had similar characteristics to a Seiko Sarb. This is my personal Sarb 035. Comes in with a fairly similar case dimension, and you can even see that the handset and the applied indices are a little bit similar, but of course this Grand Seiko takes the finishing and design to another level. And I'll also quickly hold up my 40mm white birch. This is the 5-day spring drive variation for this Grand Seiko, and you can see that the bezel on this one is a lot smaller, so you get more dial real estate, and also the bracelet is a little bit wider as well. But I do think both of these watches are extremely legible, and Grand Seiko can really pull off a white dial very, very well. Now, given this is a vintage Grand Seiko reference, you do have the dual branding for the dial here, where it says Seiko below the 12, but of course this is a Grand Seiko above a 6 o'clock position, and it also says automatic. With respect to the automatic caliber inside this watch, it's a 9S55. So that's a slightly outdated version of the current 9S series of automatic movements that Grand Seiko utilizes. But really the only drawback is a slightly less power reserve. So this is a 50-hour power reserve on this watch. The newer variations of a 9S movement will typically give you over 70. But this one is still regulated, and it's running at a modern 4 Hz. It's also hacking in hand winding, so if you unscrew the screw down crown here, you can manually wind the movement in the open position. If you pop it to the intermediate position, you can actually drive the date of the month forward, and then you can pull the crown out to extremity. You can hack the movement, and then you can set this watch to any reference time that you like. And if you ever wonder about how robust Grand Seiko movements are, I did throw this on my time grapher, and it's still running within about +4 or +5 seconds per day with minimal beat error. So to me, that's a real testament to how well Grand Seiko can pull off doing automatic movements. They're not just doing spring drive or 9F quartz movements, guys. Now, if we move away from the dial and just look at the case, the finishing for this watch is truly spectacular. Now, granted, this is a used watch, so it's got some scars on it, but it's very minimal. The crown is nicely flanked by minimal crown guards. It is screwed down, and this watch is actually water resistant to 200 meters. So in that regard, it's more like a Seiko Alpinist than like a Seiko Sarb 035. And when you combine that level of water resistance with a bulletproof bracelet and this bezel design, this watch really does straddle that sports watch with a do-everything kind of dress watch vibe. Now, in terms of potential negatives, there's not a lot to really report here. It comes down to personal preferences. For one, I do find that this watch is a little bit thick given how short the lug-to-lug measurement is. I really wish this could have been around 12 millimeters in thickness. But that being said, this is a very robust case, and of course it's a 200-meter water-resistant timepiece. And the only other minor negative, in my opinion, is that the lug opening between the bracelet here is an uneven 19 millimeters. Now, this is actually largely attenuated by the fact that I don't think I would want to put a 19 millimeter strap on this watch. I want this guy to live on the bracelet because it's just so damn good. But guys, that's my overview for the Grand Seiko SBGR017. And I would love to know your thoughts of this particular timepiece, and if there's any aspects to this type of watch you would like to see utilized by Grand Seiko moving forward. Now, if you do like the content, please consider subscribing to the channel. It does help out a lot. And as always, I can't wait to catch you guys in the next review.